Zia Lin stared at the wedding invitation in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly despite her best efforts to steady them. The golden text gleamed in the soft light of her apartment, almost mocking her. She had never thought she'd see this day. The day that Lu Ming, the man who had broken her heart years ago, was getting married. Her breath caught in her throat, a bitter taste rising in her mouth. Lu Ming and Lai Wai, the names on the invitation, sent a wave of coldness through her chest. He was finally marrying the woman he had chosen over her, the woman who had been his secret lover all along. The woman who, Zia Lin had learned too late, had never been a stranger to him. The irony was thick in the air. She wasn't even angry anymore. In fact, she couldn't remember the last time she had felt something for Lu Ming other than apathy. Their past, the way he had discarded her without even a glance back, had hardened her heart. It was just another page in her story now, but the invitation felt different, too final, too real. Zia Lin's gaze shifted from the invitation to the reflection of herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was not the same one who had loved Lu Ming so desperately all those years ago. Time had changed her, hardened her in ways she hadn't even realized. She no longer wore her heart on her sleeve. There was a coldness in her eyes now, something calculated. She had built a life after him. A life where she was in control, where she didn't rely on anyone. She didn't need him anymore, but that didn't mean the past was truly gone. As she sat down on the couch, her fingers absently playing with the edge of the invitation, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. A message from her best friend, Mia, appeared on the screen. "You really going, or is this just a petty I'll show him thing?" Zia Lin's lips curled into a faint smile. Mia had always been blunt, but she was also the one person who truly understood the weight of Zia Lin's history with Lu Ming. She knew the pain behind the mask. She knew how hard it had been to walk away from him after everything, how hard it had been to rebuild her life. Zia Lin's thumb hovered over the reply button. She could feel the old resentment, the memories of how she had suffered, how Lu Ming's betrayal had shattered her so completely. But then another thought struck her. Why hadn't he come after her? Why hadn't he fought for them? The question had been burning in the back of her mind for years now, but there was no answer. She knew that. With a sigh, Zia Lin typed a quick response. "I'm not going for him. I'm going for me. Closure, if nothing else." She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. A part of her had hoped, at some point, that Lu Ming would come running, that he would apologize and beg for her forgiveness. But after all these years, she had come to realize that he would never do that. He had moved on, and so had she. Or so she told herself. The truth, however, was more complicated. The invitation had been a jolt to her system, a reminder that no matter how much she had grown, no matter how much she had learned to live without him, the past still had a grip on her. She wasn't sure if she was ready to confront it. But then again, she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready. She glanced at the invitation again, her heart twisting in a way she hadn't expected. It had been years since she had last seen him, but everything about this moment felt like the culmination of something that had never truly ended. She had spent years trying to bury her feelings, to move on. But now, staring at the invitation, she realized she had never truly allowed herself the closure she so desperately craved. A sudden knock on the door broke her from her thoughts. Startled, she quickly stood up, slipping the invitation into her bag. She opened the door to reveal Mia, standing on the other side with an expectant look on her face. "So, you're really going?" Mia asked, her eyes scanning Zia Lin's expression. There was something searching in her gaze, as if she could see right through the facade. Zia Lin nodded, her chin lifting defiantly. "I need to. It's time to put the past to rest." Mia raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Right, just don't do anything crazy. You've built a life now, Zia Lin. Don't let him tear it down just because he's getting married." Zia Lin forced a smile, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "I won't, I've moved on." But even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't so sure. The wedding day arrived faster than Zia Lin had anticipated. She hadn't planned on feeling this way, nervous, uncertain, maybe even a little defeated. She thought she had enough distance from the past to walk in with her head held high, but now that she was standing outside the venue, the familiar weight of dread settled in her chest. The Grand Hotel loomed before her, all shining lights and lavish decorations, a stark reminder of everything she had lost. She inhaled deeply, trying to push down the unease. Just one last step, she told herself. One final confrontation with the ghosts of the past. Then, I can walk away for good. The doors swung open as she stepped into the lobby, and immediately she was struck by the grandeur of it all. The golden chandeliers, the scent of expensive perfume, the polished marble floors beneath her feet. Everything was perfect, just as she had imagined it would be. Except the one thing that should have been perfect, her heart, wasn't. As she made her way toward the ballroom, Zia Lin couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking through someone else's life. She had been invited as an afterthought, the ex-girlfriend who was now a forgotten chapter in the story of Lu Ming's life. She was surrounded by his friends and family, many of whom had once been hers too. But now there was no connection, no warmth, just the cold weight of what could have been. Zia Lin tried to focus on the guests, scanning the sea of unfamiliar faces. She didn't see Lu Ming yet, but she could feel his presence as if the air itself carried the traces of his name. She steeled herself, lifting her chin as she walked further into the room. Zia Lin? A familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. She froze, her heart lurching in her chest. She turned slowly, hoping to see anyone, but not him. But there he was, standing just a few feet away, his eyes wide with shock as they landed on her. Lu Ming. He looked the same, no, not quite the same. He was dressed in a sharp tuxedo, his hair styled perfectly, looking every bit the man he had once been. But there was something different now. Something distant in his eyes, as if the version of him she had once known no longer existed. Zia Lin, he said again, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't expected to see her here. What are you doing here? The question was simple enough, but it hit her like a punch to the gut. She could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to show up. Why would he? After all, they hadn't spoken since their bitter breakup years ago. Zia Lin's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the world seemed to pause around her, the sound of soft chatter fading into the background. All she could hear was the steady beat of her own pulse. I was invited, she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. Lu Ming's lips parted, as if he wanted to say something more, but his gaze kept darting toward the other side of the room. Suddenly, Zia Lin noticed her, Lai Wai. She was standing by the corner, talking to a group of people, her radiant smile lighting up the room. The woman who had always been in the shadows of Zia Lin's life, the one who had quietly slipped into the space Lu Ming had once reserved for her. Lai Wai was everything Zia Lin wasn't, quiet, obedient, the perfect woman in Lu Ming's eyes. She felt a rush of nausea. You're here, Lu Ming said, his voice softer now, but his gaze flickering nervously between Zia Lin and Lai Wai. Zia Lin didn't respond right away. Her heart was heavy, burdened with the memories of her past with him, the sweet moments, the promises, and the painful betrayal when she discovered that he had been in love with Lai Wai all along. It had been the ultimate blow, the one that had shattered her belief in love, in herself. And now, here they were. She could feel the distance between them, the chasm that had grown over the years. There was no more lingering hope in her heart, but the pain still lingered. It wasn't something she could just forget. She took a breath, forcing herself to focus. I just wanted to see it for myself, she said, her tone cool. To see how perfect everything is, how perfect you are. Lu Ming flinched. It wasn't lost on her that he looked both guilty and ashamed, as if her words had hit a nerve, but there was no apology in his eyes. Not now. Not ever. Before he could respond, Lai Wai appeared at his side, her eyes scanning Zia Lin with the calmness of someone who had nothing to fear. Zia Lin, Lai Wai said, her voice almost too sweet. I'm so glad you could make it. I didn't expect to see you here. Zia Lin's gaze flicked from one woman to the other. The polite smile on Lai Wai's face barely masked the quiet triumph in her eyes. Zia Lin clenched her fists at her sides. Of course I came, she said, forcing a smile. I wanted to see the happy couple for myself. Lu Ming opened his mouth to speak again, but this time Zia Lin didn't wait for him. She turned and walked away from them, her mind racing. The shock of seeing them together, of hearing their forced pleasantries, rattled her more than she'd anticipated. But there was something else beneath the surface. A stirring, an unsettling feeling in her gut that she couldn't quite place. Why had they invited her? Why had Lu Ming, of all people, reached out after all these years? Before she could unravel the mystery, Mia's voice cut through the chaos in her mind. There you are, Mia said, approaching her quickly. How are you holding up? Zia Lin let out a bitter laugh. I don't know, Mia, but something doesn't feel right. I think I might have just walked into something I'm not supposed to know. Zia Lin couldn't shake the feeling that she was an intruder in her own life. It had been 5 years since she had last seen Lu Ming, and yet the raw sting of their breakup was still fresh enough to make her stomach twist every time she found herself caught in his orbit. She had come here today, prepared to put on a brave face, but the reality of it was worse than she'd imagined. She had always thought that time would make it easier to heal. That one day, she'd be able to look at him without the ache in her chest. But here she was, standing at a lavish wedding reception, surrounded by the very people who had once called her a part of their world. The only thing different now was that Lu Ming wasn't hers anymore. The heavy sounds of laughter and chatter surrounded her, but the room felt too small. She wanted to leave, to disappear, but there was something else that kept her tethered to this place, a feeling of unresolved closure. Mia, noticing her discomfort, gently nudged her arm. "Are you okay?" "I don't think I can do this," Zia Lin whispered, her voice tight with the weight of everything she hadn't said. Mia smiled sympathetically. "You don't have to stay long, just take it easy." Zia Lin nodded, trying to smile back, but her eyes kept returning to Lu Ming. He was standing in the far corner with Lai Wai, exchanging pleasantries with the guests. Lai Wai's laughter sounded so natural, so effortless, it made Zia Lin's throat tighten. Everything about her seemed perfect, perfectly poised, perfectly suited for the life that Zia Lin had once thought was her own. Forcing herself to look away, Zia Lin wandered further into the ballroom. Her eyes scanned the room, but her mind was elsewhere. The wedding dress, the sparkling decorations, the clinking of glasses, none of it seemed to matter. She could feel the ghosts of her past standing over her shoulder, reminding her of everything she had once had and everything that had slipped through her fingers. She spotted a quiet corner near the large windows that overlooked the city, and, craving solitude, she walked toward it. As she neared the window, she paused. The reflection that stared back at her wasn't the woman she had imagined she would become. She had always thought that time would make her stronger, more confident, but all she saw now was the woman who had been betrayed, abandoned, and left to pick up the pieces of a life that never felt like it was truly hers to begin with. "Is this where the heartbroken go to hide?" The voice that broke through her thoughts made her jump, and she turned to see someone standing in the shadows, someone she had hoped to avoid all evening. Liu Ren, her former college friend and the one person who had always seen through her pretenses. He was still the same tall, confident, with that wry smile that always seemed to know more than it should. "What are you doing here?" Zia Lin asked, trying to sound casual, but the question came out sharper than she intended. Liu Ren raised an eyebrow. "I could ask you the same thing. You don't exactly blend into the crowd here, Zia Lin." "I'm not here for the celebration," she replied, her eyes narrowing. "Just here to check something off my list." Liu Ren took a step closer, his gaze studying her intently. "Right, you've been avoiding me for years and now you're here at his wedding. You don't think that's a little strange?" She tensed, the words hitting too close to home. "I'm not here for Lu Ming." "Then who are you here for?" For a moment, Zia Lin didn't answer. She didn't even know how to explain it to him. There was something about Lu Ming, about that unfinished chapter of her life, that lingered like a shadow over her. But that was a truth she hadn't even admitted to herself until now. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "Maybe I just wanted to see if I could still feel something. Anything." Liu Ren's gaze softened. "Zia Lin," he paused, searching her face. "You know that this isn't your world anymore, right? You walked away from it a long time ago. You don't have to go back." "I didn't walk away," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He made the decision for both of us." Liu Ren let out a low sigh, stepping closer and offering her a reassuring smile. "Then why stay if this doesn't make you happy?" She stared at him for a moment, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. But before she could respond, a familiar voice reached her ears and she froze. "Zia Lin," she turned slowly, and there he was again. Lu Ming. Standing there, looking as if he had all the time in the world, but still with that same expression of uncertainty. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough to make her heart skip. Zia Lin opened her mouth to refuse, but the words got stuck in her throat. Part of her wanted to walk away, to leave and never look back. But another part of her, the part that had spent years living in the shadow of what could have been, needed to hear him say the words that would finally put an end to the questions that had haunted her. Liu Ren noticed the tension between them and raised an eyebrow. "I'll give you two a moment," he muttered, stepping back into the crowd. As Zia Lin stood alone with Lu Ming, the silence between them felt like a vast chasm, one that neither of them knew how to cross. I wasn't expecting to see you here, Lu Ming said, his eyes searching hers, though she could tell he was avoiding the weight of his own actions. I thought you would have moved on by now. Zia Lin didn't answer immediately. The years of silence and pain had made her numb to his words, but she couldn't help but ask the question that had been on her mind ever since she walked in. Why did you invite me? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Was this some kind of test? Lu Ming faltered, clearly unprepared for her bluntness. He swallowed hard before speaking again. I wanted to see you again, to know if we could. He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, it was foolish. Zia Lin shook her head, feeling a bitter laugh bubbling up. Foolish, you don't even know what you're asking. And with that, she turned and walked away from him, feeling his eyes on her back. This wasn't the reunion she had expected. It wasn't even the closure she had longed for. It was just another reminder of everything that had been left unsaid, unanswered. The air in the ballroom was stifling now, the once cheerful atmosphere swallowed by the tension that followed her confrontation with Lu Ming. Zia Lin felt like an outsider in her own life, the weight of her past pressing down on her like a heavy hand on her chest. She had walked away from Lu Ming again, but the words he had said echoed in her mind. I wanted to see you again. He had sounded so genuine, so uncertain. For a moment she had almost believed him, but the truth lingered. He had left her once, choosing someone else over her. That was something she could never forget, no matter how much time had passed. Zia Lin wandered aimlessly through the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of people who no longer meant anything to her. Her steps led her toward the balcony, where the cool night air offered a brief respite from the suffocating tension. As she stepped outside, she was greeted by the sight of the city lights sprawling beneath her, the glittering skyline a distant reminder of everything she had worked so hard to escape. Zia Lin. The voice behind her was unmistakable. She turned, already feeling the familiar ache in her chest. Lu Ming stepped out onto the balcony, his expression serious. I didn't mean to upset you. Then why did you say those things? She asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. You know what this is. It's not that simple. I know, Lu Ming admitted, stepping closer. But I've been thinking about us, about how things ended. It wasn't right, Zia Lin. Zia Lin closed her eyes, trying to block out the whirlwind of emotions threatening to take control. It wasn't right, no, but you had your reasons. You made your choice and I? She cut herself off, the words heavy in her throat. He stepped closer, his gaze intense. I regret it. Choosing her over you, I was a fool. Her heart hammered in her chest, the truth of his words sinking in like a blade. The familiar ache of longing was there again, but so was the sharp bitterness of betrayal. Regret doesn't change anything, Lu Ming. You can't just come back into my life like nothing happened. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, he said softly, but I need to know if there's a chance, if you could forgive me. Zia Lin's breath caught. Forgive him? How could she forgive him when all the pain, all the sleepless nights, and all the self-doubt still lingered? Forgive you? She repeated the word, tasting it on her tongue like something foreign, something she had never thought she would have to say. You left me. You broke me. And now you think a few words will make it all go away? She felt her eyes welling up, but she quickly wiped them away. She wouldn't give him that power, not anymore. I don't need your forgiveness, Lu Ming. I've moved on, or at least I thought I had. She could see the flicker of pain in his eyes, but he didn't try to stop her this time as she turned away, walking back into the ballroom. Her mind was racing. Her heart ached, not with love, but with the bitter taste of a past she couldn't outrun. But as she walked deeper into the crowd, a figure caught her eye. Lai Wai, the woman who had taken her place in Lu Ming's life. She was standing near the bar, a glass of champagne in hand, her eyes locked on Zia Lin with a look of smug satisfaction. Zia Lin felt a flare of anger rise within her. It wasn't just the betrayal she had to face. It was this woman, this constant reminder of everything that had been stolen from her. She walked toward Lai Wai, her steps firm and purposeful. The last thing she wanted was to let her emotions take over, but there was something about Lai Wai's presence that always seemed to make her feel small, insignificant. When Lai Wai saw her approaching, she didn't smile. She didn't even acknowledge her with a polite nod. Instead, she took a slow sip of her drink, her eyes never leaving Zia Lin's face. Well, Lai Wai said, her tone dripping with sarcasm, I wasn't sure if you'd stick around for the wedding. Not really your scene, is it? Zia Lin felt the heat of her anger build. You're right, it's not my scene. But then again, neither is your place in Lu Ming's life. Lai Wai raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. It's funny, isn't it? How people always think they can walk back into someone's life after abandoning them. But then again, you didn't really leave, did you? Zia Lin clenched her fists, fighting to keep her voice steady. You don't know anything about me, or about Lu Ming. I know enough, Lai Wai said, her smile widening. I know that he chose me, and I know that you couldn't even keep him. So here we are. Zia Lin felt a sharp pang of frustration, but she refused to give in to it. Instead, she took a deep breath, locking eyes with Lai Wai. You're right, he chose you, but I'm not here for him, I'm here for me. And with that, she turned away, pushing past Lai Wai and the stinging words that followed her like a weight. She had faced Lai Wai and survived. She had stood her ground, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Her first attempt at reclaiming herself, her first attempt to confront the ghosts of her past, had failed. Zia Lin stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her apartment, staring at her reflection. The woman who stared back at her was no longer the naive girl who had once loved Lu Ming with all her heart. She had changed, grown, perhaps, but also hardened. The edges of her emotions had become sharper, more jagged, and now she was stuck, caught between the woman she was becoming and the woman she used to be. Tonight's gala had been a wake-up call. She had always thought that by keeping her distance, she could move on. But it wasn't just Lu Ming's reappearance that was the problem. It was her own unresolved feelings, the ones she had buried so deeply that she hadn't truly faced. Her phone buzzed on the counter, interrupting her thoughts. She walked over to grab it, already knowing who it was before she even looked at the screen. Lai Wai. The text was brief but loaded with meaning. If you really want to move on, stop holding on to him. The past is gone, and you're just clinging to a memory. Let it go before it eats you alive. Zia Lin scoffed, tossing her phone onto the couch. Of course, Lai Wai would send something like that, but the words still stung, as much as she hated to admit it. Could Lai Wai be right? Was she still holding onto a ghost of the past, too afraid to truly let go and move on? She wasn't sure anymore. Her mind wandered back to the conversation with Lu Ming. He had said he regretted choosing Lai Wai over her. He had said he wanted to make things right. But what if that wasn't enough? What if that apology was just words, empty, hollow, like so many others before it? Zia Lin exhaled sharply. There had to be more to this, more to her own journey than simply mending broken relationships. It was time to stop letting Lu Ming's presence dictate her life. Time to take control, to stop playing the victim in this narrative she had allowed herself to be trapped in for so long. She needed to move forward, and not just with her career or her daily routines. She needed to face the deepest part of herself, the part that had been stuck in the past, unable to truly heal. She had never allowed herself the space to grieve fully, to process what had happened, and now that she was back in the same room with her past, she realized how much she had been lying to herself. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, social events, and mindless distractions. Zia Lin tried to focus on her work, trying to bury the memories of the gala, but they kept resurfacing, impossible to ignore. Her conversations with friends and colleagues felt hollow, like they were all just distractions from the real problem she had to face. It wasn't until a late-night walk through the city that she finally felt the weight of it all. The neon lights illuminated the street ahead of her, casting a cold glow on the pavement as she walked with no destination in mind. Her thoughts were a jumble of anger, confusion, and sadness, all the emotions she had bottled up for so long. She passed by a small bookstore that had always been one of her favorite places to escape. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The familiar smell of old paper and leather bindings wrapped around her, offering a strange sense of comfort. Her fingers brushed over the spines of the books as she wandered through the aisles, not really looking for anything specific. But then, something caught her eye. A small, worn-out journal sat on a shelf, almost as if it were waiting for her. She pulled it from the shelf, its weight surprisingly comforting in her hands. The cover was soft and faded, the gold lettering barely visible. She flipped it open, finding the first few pages filled with scribbled notes, half-formed thoughts, and messy sketches. It felt like the words of someone who had been lost, just like her. The journal spoke of heartbreak, longing, and the search for self-identity, all things she knew far too well. Without thinking, she bought it. The act was impulsive, but there was something about the journal, the need to connect with someone else's words, that called to her. Maybe, just maybe, writing in it would help her make sense of the tangled mess in her own heart. That night, after returning home, she sat on her bed, the journal open in front of her. Her pen hovered over the page, unsure of what to write. It felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to jump but too scared to move. But then, slowly, the words came. I've been running for so long, hiding from the truth. I tell myself I'm fine, that I've let go of him, but I know that's a lie. I've built walls around my heart so high that I can't even remember what it feels like to let someone in. Lu Ming, he's not the problem. It's me. I haven't forgiven myself for letting him go so easily. But how do you forgive yourself for loving someone who chose someone else? As her pen flowed across the pages, Zia Lin felt something inside of her loosen. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything: the pain, the betrayal, the loss. She wasn't holding on to Lu Ming anymore. She was finally letting go of the person she had been, the version of herself who couldn't forgive or move on. And as she closed the journal, she felt a small sense of relief. She wasn't entirely healed, but she was taking the first step toward it. It wasn't about forgiving Lu Ming or even Lai Wai. It was about forgiving herself. The past wasn't something that could be fixed. It could only be accepted. And once she accepted it, once she let go, she could finally move forward. Zia Lin's new resolve to move on felt fragile, like the early bloom of a flower still uncertain in its growth. For a while, things seemed to go smoothly. She focused on her work, deepened her connections with her friends, and spent more time doing things that made her feel whole. But the past, no matter how far she tried to bury it, wasn't quite done with her. A week had passed since the night she started journaling, and she thought she was finally starting to find her balance. That was until she walked into her office on Monday morning, greeted by the uneasy buzz of office gossip in the air. It was rare for Zia Lin to get swept into the current of office drama, but this time, she couldn't avoid it. Lai Wai was standing at the coffee machine, talking in hushed tones with a colleague. As soon as Zia Lin entered the office, Lai Wai's gaze met hers, and for a fleeting second, their eyes locked with the weight of unspoken history. Zia Lin tried to ignore the flicker of discomfort in her chest, but it was like a thread pulling at her. She hadn't expected to see Lai Wai today, not like this. Zia Lin, Lai Wai called out, her voice sweet but carrying an edge Zia Lin couldn't ignore. Could I talk to you for a moment? Zia Lin hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. She had worked hard to distance herself from Lai Wai emotionally, but she knew that avoiding confrontation would only make it worse in the long run. Still, the instinct to run was almost overwhelming. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to respond. Sure. They walked together down the hall, Lai Wai leading the way with a confident stride that contrasted Zia Lin's more measured steps. Zia Lin knew she couldn't avoid this conversation forever. The tension between them was undeniable, and it had only been growing since their last encounter. As they reached the small conference room at the end of the hall, Lai Wai shut the door behind them. Zia Lin didn't sit down. She had no intention of making herself comfortable in this discussion. She stood tall, forcing herself to meet Lai Wai's gaze. What is it you wanted to talk about? Zia Lin asked, her voice steady. Lai Wai leaned against the table, folding her arms. Her posture was casual, but the underlying tension was palpable. I've been hearing things, Zia Lin, things about you and Lu Ming. You two seemed quite cozy at the gala. Zia Lin's stomach tightened. Of course, she had expected this conversation eventually. Lai Wai was no fool. Still, hearing her bring it up so directly felt like a slap. There's nothing between us, Zia Lin replied flatly, her voice tight with annoyance. We talked, that's all. Lai Wai's lips curled into a sly smile, but there was a certain hardness behind her eyes that Zia Lin hadn't seen before. Really? Because I heard differently. Word is he's been telling people that you two have unfinished business. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Is that what you want, Zia Lin? To go back to someone who's been so careless with you? The question landed like a punch. For a moment, Zia Lin couldn't find the words. Was that what she wanted? Was that why she had let him back into her life at all? No, Zia Lin replied, her voice quieter but firm. That's not it. It's complicated, but it's in the past. I'm moving on. Lai Wai raised an eyebrow, seemingly unconvinced. I don't know if you're fooling yourself or if you actually think you're the one who got away unscathed. But you didn't, Zia Lin. You never do. The words stung, sharper than she had anticipated. Lai Wai had always been skilled with her barbs, but this one felt personal. She couldn't understand why Lai Wai was going to such lengths to provoke her. You're right, Zia Lin said slowly, her voice measured. I didn't get away unscathed, but neither did you, Lai Wai. Neither of us did. Lai Wai's smile faltered, and for a split second, Zia Lin could see something in her eyes, a crack in the armor, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Lai Wai straightened up, her eyes hardening once again. Maybe, Lai Wai said, her tone a little colder now, but at least I know what I want. You're still stuck in the past, trying to hold on to a man who never wanted you enough. Zia Lin clenched her fists at her sides, fighting to maintain control. She had been determined to let go of the past. But this confrontation had hit too close to the raw wound she had been avoiding. It was as though Lai Wai had found the one thing that could unravel her lingering doubts about whether she had truly moved on or if she had merely buried her feelings. Zia Lin exhaled slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't need your approval, Lai Wai. I'm not doing this for you. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Lai Wai behind with her sharp words echoing in her ears. Back in her office, Zia Lin tried to calm herself, but the conversation replayed over and over in her mind. Lai Wai's words had cut deeper than she had expected. She had told herself she was fine, that she was finally moving on, but there was still something there, something she hadn't fully confronted. The truth was, she didn't know what she wanted anymore. Part of her was afraid that Lu Ming would come back, and she would fall right back into the same old patterns. But another part of her was afraid of being completely alone, of never knowing the kind of love she had once imagined with him. Just as her thoughts began to spiral, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Lai Wai. I hope you're not fooling yourself, Zia Lin. He's not coming back for you. Don't make the same mistake twice. Zia Lin stared at the message, the words sinking into her with a heaviness that threatened to swallow her whole. She couldn't let herself be controlled by Lai Wai's bitterness or her own insecurities. But as the phone slipped from her hands, she knew something had to change. She couldn't keep living in this emotional limbo. The next step, she realized, wasn't about Lu Ming, Lai Wai, or anyone else. It was about her. The days that followed the confrontation with Lai Wai felt like a blur. Zia Lin's attempts to focus on her work were undermined by the constant buzz of doubts that echoed in her mind. She had been telling herself for weeks that she was ready to move on, but now, with Lai Wai's words haunting her, she wasn't so sure anymore. Every time she ran into Lu Ming, whether at work, at social events, or even in passing, it was as if the past was slowly creeping back into her life, pulling her down in ways she hadn't expected. One evening, as the office began to empty out, Zia Lin sat at her desk, scrolling through old emails. She hadn't expected to feel so vulnerable again, so uncertain. Her hand hovered over the keyboard, but she couldn't bring herself to type the words she knew she needed to. She wanted to contact Lu Ming, she wanted to ask him about his feelings, to finally understand where they stood. But deep down, Zia Lin feared that reaching out would only confirm her worst fear, that she had been nothing more than a fleeting chapter in his life, that after all these years, her feelings had been nothing more than an echo of something he had long forgotten. The office lights dimmed as the evening wore on. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day wash over her. Just as she was about to stand up and leave, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Lu Ming. Zia Lin, can we talk? The words caught her off guard. She stared at the screen, the weight of his message hitting her all at once. For a moment, she felt an odd sense of both relief and dread. She had been waiting for this moment, hoping he would reach out. But now that it was here, it felt different. It felt like the kind of conversation that would change everything, for better or for worse. After a long pause, she typed back. Where? My place, if you can. Zia Lin hesitated for a moment longer, then quickly gathered her things and left the office. The familiar ache in her chest returned as she made her way to his apartment. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, but this was the moment that would either heal her or break her. When she arrived at his apartment, she stood in front of the door for a few moments, taking a deep breath. She didn't know what she was expecting, but she was certain that the answers she sought wouldn't be easy to hear. When the door opened, Lu Ming stood there, his expression unreadable. Come in, he said softly, stepping aside to let her in. Zia Lin walked in, feeling the weight of the unspoken tension between them. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Lu Ming closed the door behind them, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned to sit on the couch. I know this isn't easy, he began, his voice low. But I've been thinking about us, about everything we've been through. Zia Lin remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest. So, what exactly do you want, Lu Ming? What is it that you've been thinking? He exhaled slowly, his eyes meeting hers. I don't know how to explain this, but I feel like I've been running away from something I should have confronted a long time ago. Zia Lin raised an eyebrow, confused. What do you mean? I mean us, Lu Ming said, his voice a little more strained now. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. And I'm not asking for forgiveness or even for us to get back together. But I need you to understand that I've been carrying this guilt for a long time. Zia Lin's chest tightened. She had heard this before, or something close to it. She had heard all the apologies and explanations when they had first broken up, but it hadn't been enough. You hurt me, Lu Ming, she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to stay calm. And I can't keep pretending that it doesn't matter. I can't keep running back to you every time you decide you want something from me. Lu Ming's face fell, and he looked away. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know what I was doing back then. You didn't know, Zia Lin echoed, her voice cracking with emotion. You didn't know that betraying me, that lying to me would hurt me? You didn't know that I loved you more than anything, and you tore that apart? The words were out before she could stop them, and her throat tightened as she fought back tears. She hadn't meant to let her anger and hurt spill out like that, but it was as though the dam she had carefully constructed over the past year had finally broken. I don't know how to make it right, Lu Ming whispered, his voice full of regret. I don't even know if I can, but I need you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. Zia Lin stared at him, the intensity of her emotions overwhelming her. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to demand that he take back every word he had ever said to her, every lie he had told. But another part of her, the part that had never stopped loving him, no matter how much she had tried to move on, wanted to believe him. But how could she? How could she trust him again after everything? I can't do this, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't keep going back to this. I can't keep letting you pull me in and out of your life when it's convenient for you. For a long moment, Lu Ming said nothing. His eyes were filled with pain, but Zia Lin couldn't allow herself to feel sorry for him anymore. She had been stuck in this cycle for too long. She turned to leave, but before she could reach the door, Lu Ming's voice stopped her. Zia Lin, please. Don't go. I need you to know that I am sorry, and I'll always be sorry for how I treated you. Zia Lin stood frozen, her hand on the doorknob. For a moment, everything inside her screamed to turn around, to throw herself into his arms and beg for a resolution. But then she remembered the past, remembered the hurt, the broken promises, and the lies. I'm sorry, Lu Ming, but I need to let you go, she said quietly, before opening the door and stepping out of his apartment for the last time. The days that followed her confrontation with Lu Ming were harder than Zia Lin had anticipated. Every corner of her life seemed to echo with the weight of the decision she had made. But as painful as it was, there was no turning back. She had taken the steps she needed to take, no matter how much it hurt. At work, her usual determination returned. The business of the day, the cold facts and figures, were easier to manage than the chaos swirling in her heart. Yet, even as she focused on the tasks at hand, her mind drifted back to the conversation with Lu Ming. His words, those words of regret and sorrow, kept playing over and over in her mind. Had she made the right choice? Was walking away the only thing she could do? But there was something else gnawing at her, something she hadn't fully realized until now. Zia Lin stood by the window of her office, looking out at the city below, trying to shake off the thoughts of Lu Ming that clung to her. She could still feel the weight of his gaze on her when she left his apartment. That last moment before she walked out, his voice had wavered, as if he had something else to say, something that could change everything. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text message and she almost didn't want to look. But when she saw the name, Lai Wai, it was like a splash of cold water to her face. We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow at the cafe we used to go to? Zia Lin frowned, unsure of what to make of it. Lai Wai had always been a constant presence in her life, but their last conversation had left her confused. What could he possibly want now? After everything she'd been through, she didn't know if she was ready for more emotional upheaval. But the nagging feeling that she couldn't escape whatever had been left unsaid between them was powerful. She sat down at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Should she respond? Should she ignore it? In the end, she knew the answer. Okay, I'll be there. The next afternoon, Zia Lin found herself sitting at the same cafe where she had once shared countless hours with Lai Wai. The soft hum of conversation around her felt like a distant noise as she waited. She hadn't seen him in weeks, and even now, as she waited for him to arrive, she felt a familiar tension build up inside her. Part of her had hoped their relationship would fade into the past, but it seemed fate had other plans. The door opened, and there he was. Lai Wai walked in with his usual calm demeanor, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on her. He was dressed casually, but there was an unease about him that Zia Lin couldn't quite place. As he approached the table, she noticed the slight frown on his face, the way his lips were pressed tight, as though he was about to say something that had been on his mind for a long time. Zia Lin, he greeted her softly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar edge. Lai Wai, she replied, trying to sound neutral though inside, a storm was raging. He sat down across from her, his eyes searching hers. There was a moment of silence between them before he spoke again. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice steady but laden with an undercurrent of tension, "about everything that's happened, about what you said to me the last time we talked." Zia Lin raised an eyebrow, trying to gauge what he was getting at. "What exactly are you thinking, Lai Wai?" He shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. "You were right, I was a coward, and I never gave you the closure you needed. I wasn't fair to you." Zia Lin clenched her fists under the table, trying to keep her composure. "You weren't just a coward, Lai Wai, you were dishonest. You told me you cared about me, but you didn't, at least, not in the way I needed you to. I gave everything and you just left." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I regret it, every day." She looked at him, the man who had been a constant in her life until he suddenly became a shadow of a memory. There was something different about him now, something more vulnerable, but that didn't change the years of hurt he had caused her. "You regret it?" she repeated, her voice hard. "I've had years to regret it too. To regret everything about our relationship, the way I let you in, only to have you walk away when it got hard." Lai Wai sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it, Zia Lin. I need you to understand that I've changed. I've spent so much time figuring out why I pushed you away, and I know now it was because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" she asked, almost disbelieving. "Afraid of how much I loved you," he said softly, his eyes locking with hers. "I've always loved you, but I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to be the person you needed me to be." Zia Lin swallowed hard. The words he spoke resonated in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't the first time Lai Wai had confessed his feelings to her, but there was something raw in his voice now, something that made her wonder if there was still a part of him that could give her what she needed. She sat back, her mind spinning. Could she trust him? Should she even try? "I don't know if I can forgive you, Lai Wai," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know if I can trust you again after everything that's happened." For the first time in their conversation, he looked truly lost. "I understand," he murmured. "I can't ask for anything more, but I need you to know that I've changed, Zia Lin. And I'll wait for as long as it takes for you to see that." Zia Lin felt the familiar ache in her chest, the one that always came with love, with pain, with the question of whether it was worth it to take the risk again. But this time, she wasn't sure. "I don't know what I want, Lai Wai," she admitted, the weight of her words sinking in. "But I can't make this decision yet." He nodded slowly, the sadness in his eyes evident. "I understand. Take your time." The cafe, with its warmth and quiet murmur, felt suddenly too small, too intimate for the weight of their conversation. Zia Lin stood up, her legs trembling under the weight of the decision she had yet to make. "I'll see you around," she said softly, before turning and walking away from him, unsure of what the future held. But as she stepped out into the cool evening air, she couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of something new, or the final end to a chapter she had been struggling to leave behind? The days following her meeting with Lai Wai were a blur, and Zia Lin found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't escape. It was as if every step she took brought her closer to a crossroads, and the direction she was headed felt more uncertain than ever. The guilt, the anger, the love, it all swirled together inside her, like a storm that wouldn't settle. But amidst the confusion, one thing was clear: Zia Lin couldn't keep running from her past. The encounter with Lai Wai had been a catalyst, forcing her to confront feelings she had buried for so long. And even though she wasn't ready to forgive him, there was a part of her that couldn't deny the raw truth in his words. He had changed, at least he claimed to have. But was that enough? The moment that truly changed everything came when Lu Ming reached out to her once again. Zia Lin had been avoiding his calls for weeks, not knowing what to say, not knowing what to do. The hurt he had caused her felt like a gaping wound in her chest, one she didn't know how to heal. But she couldn't ignore him forever, and so, after much hesitation, she answered his call one evening. Zia Lin, his voice came through the phone, rough and tired, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I know you're angry, you have every right to be, but please, can we talk? Just for a moment, I need to explain. Her heart clenched at the sound of his voice. He had hurt her, he had destroyed everything between them, but something in his tone made her feel as if she couldn't deny him. I don't know what there is left to say, Lu Ming, she said, her voice steady but laced with pain. Please, he begged. I don't want to lose you. I know I've failed you in every way, but I can't let you go like this. I never should have pushed you away. Please let me make it right. Zia Lin felt the tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined not to give in to the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. You don't get to make it right, Lu Ming, she replied, her voice low. Not after everything you've done. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he spoke again, his voice quieter now. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm asking for a chance. Just a chance to show you that I'm not the person I was. I'll do anything, Zia Lin. I'll prove it to you if you'll just give me that one moment. Her heart pounded in her chest as his words echoed in her mind. The man who had once been everything to her was pleading for another chance. She had never imagined this moment, and yet here it was, hanging between them like a fragile thread. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling as if the weight of the world was bearing down on her. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive him, or even if she could ever trust him again, but she also knew that she couldn't keep living in the shadows of her past. I'll meet you, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But this doesn't mean everything is fixed, Lu Ming. This doesn't mean I'm coming back to you. I know, he responded, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and desperation. But I'll wait. I'll wait for as long as it takes, Zia Lin. Thank you. That was all it took to seal their fate. The next evening, Zia Lin found herself standing in front of Lu Ming's apartment building, her heart racing in her chest. She had no idea what to expect, no idea what kind of person he would be when they finally came face to face. Would he be the man who had once held her heart in his hands, or would he be someone unrecognizable? As she walked into the building and made her way to his door, she couldn't help but wonder if she was making a mistake. What if she wasn't ready for this? What if she couldn't handle the flood of emotions that would come with reopening this door? But there was no turning back now. She knocked softly, her pulse quickening. A moment later, the door opened and there he stood, Lu Ming. For a brief moment, neither of them said anything. They just looked at each other, the weight of everything between them hanging in the air. Zia Lin, Lu Ming whispered, his voice raw, I never thought I'd see you again. She didn't know how to respond. The words felt stuck in her throat as though she was too afraid to speak the truth. But she couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, not anymore. You're right, she said quietly, her voice steady but fragile. You never thought I'd come back, but here I am. He stepped aside, letting her enter. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with unspoken words. Zia Lin sat down on the couch, her body tense as she waited for him to say something. I've been thinking a lot, he said, his voice distant. About what you said to me. About how I failed you. And it's been eating me up inside, Zia Lin. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I even can, but I want to try, for you, for us. Zia Lin's heart clenched at the sincerity in his words. She had wanted to hear him say this for so long. But now that he had, it felt like a bitter reminder of everything they had lost. Lu Ming, you hurt me, she said, her voice trembling. You broke me, and I don't know if I can forgive you for that. I don't know if I can trust you again. He sat down next to her, his eyes filled with regret. I know, and I'm sorry, I can't undo the past, but I can promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. The words hung in the air like a fragile thread, and Zia Lin found herself at a crossroads. Could she truly find a way back to him? Could she take the risk of opening her heart again? But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that the answer wasn't clear. There was no simple solution, no easy way out. The choice she made now would shape the rest of her life, and she wasn't sure she was ready to make it. For a long moment, they simply sat there, the silence between them thick with emotion. And then, as the clock ticked on, the weight of their past and their uncertain future hung in the balance. The air in the room felt thick, each breath a reminder of the overwhelming weight of their shared history. The silence that followed was laden with unspoken words, the past hanging between them like a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. Zia Lin's mind raced as she tried to process everything. Lu Ming's pleading, his genuine regret, the memory of the pain he had caused her, it all collided inside her, leaving her paralyzed. What did she want? Could she forgive him? Was it possible to rebuild something from the ruins they had left behind? Her heart ached with the thought of walking away, but the thought of staying, of trying again, was just as terrifying. In this quiet moment, it felt as though the decision would define the rest of her life. The past had shattered her trust, but the future seemed impossible to imagine without him, no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise. "I don't know if I can," she said softly, her voice shaking. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Lu Ming. What we had, it's gone, it's been ruined." Lu Ming's face tightened, the pain in his eyes evident, but he didn't argue. He simply reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I understand," he said quietly. "I really do. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I would never ask you to forgive me overnight. All I'm asking for is time. Time to prove that I can change. Time to show you that the man I was isn't who I am now. If you can't find it in yourself to love me again, then I'll leave. But if you can give me a chance, I'll do everything I can to be worthy of your love." Zia Lin stared at their joined hands, her mind a whirlpool of confusion. She had always been the one to leave, to move forward, never looking back. But now, here she was, on the edge of a decision that could alter everything. "I don't know if I believe you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust that the man sitting next to me is really who you are now." Lu Ming squeezed her hand gently. "I know, and I won't ask you to trust me just like that. But I promise you, Zia Lin, I'm not the man I was. I'm not perfect, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that to you." Zia Lin closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of peace amidst the chaos in her heart. It wasn't easy to let go of the pain. It wasn't easy to trust again. But as she thought about everything she had learned in the past few months, about herself, about love, about forgiveness, she realized that perhaps the hardest thing to do was to forgive herself, to stop carrying the burden of the past. With a heavy sigh, she opened her eyes and met his gaze. "I don't know if I can love you the same way again, Lu Ming," she said softly, "but I'm willing to try. For both of us." A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips, and there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. He had waited for this moment, prayed for it, and now it was finally within his reach. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. "I won't let you down." The weeks that followed were a slow process of rebuilding. Zia Lin and Lu Ming didn't rush back into the relationship. Instead, they took it one step at a time, learning to trust each other again, to communicate without the walls they had built around themselves. There were moments of doubt, of course, and times when Zia Lin wondered if she had made the right choice. But with every small victory, with every shared moment of honesty, the foundation of something new began to form. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was ever perfect. But Zia Lin began to see that sometimes, love wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being willing to fight for each other, even when the odds seemed impossible. One evening, after a long day, they sat together on the balcony of her apartment, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Zia Lin leaned back in her chair, feeling a peace she hadn't known in months. "You know," Lu Ming said, his voice quiet, "I never thought I'd be here with you again. After everything, I thought I'd lost you forever." Zia Lin smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. "You almost did," she admitted, "but I think we both needed to learn something about ourselves before we could move forward." Lu Ming reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "I'm glad you're willing to try. I won't take that for granted." Zia Lin squeezed his hand, looking out at the horizon. "Neither will I." The journey wasn't over. They still had a long way to go, and the scars of the past would never completely fade. But in this moment, as they sat side by side, Zia Lin knew that forgiveness wasn't a one-time thing. It was a choice, made every day, in small actions and quiet promises. And in that quiet peace, she realized something important. Sometimes, second chances were the hardest, but also the most beautiful of all.